Let's look at the definition of the term gamification. Quite simply, gamification uses the elements of games to motivate and engage the learner. In order to better understand this concept, let's look at the elements that comprise most basic board games.
First, you have the board with marked spaces on which you play. This is the game space. This is the context in which the player plays the game. Usually a game has cards or some other elements that incrementally reveal information to the player. An element of chance exists in most games, created by a spinner or dice. In games, you have pieces, which are basically stand-ins for the player. And finally, you have spaces on the board that reward the player for accomplishments. Gamification is the breaking up of a game into its fundamental elements. Each element of the board game can be abstracted and used to engage learners. The pieces can be considered an avatar, a representation of the player. The dice represent the element of chance. The unpredictability of a game can add mystery. The player can receive points within a game, and the in-game rewards can be thought of as digital badges, while the game board itself is the context or story encompassing all other activities. And of course, in many games, you also have competition and even cooperation among players. From an instructional context, gamification is using game-based mechanics, aesthetics, and game thinking to engage people, motivate action, promote learning, and solve problems in a non-game context. Gamification may seem like a strange or scary word, but the concepts behind it are gaining momentum. The term gamification has not been around very long. The term appears to have been coined in 2002 by Nick Pelling on a web page, but the term did not gain widespread recognition until about late 2010, and now the term and concept are picking up momentum. According to figures reported on PR Web, in 2013, the gamification industry was a $421 million industry. And by 2018, it's expected to go to a $5.5 billion industry. That's a growth rate of 67%. And while gamification is gaining momentum, it is still often confused with learning games and simulations. Technically, gamification is not the same thing as a learning game or simulation. A learning game or serious game is typically a self-contained unit that has all the elements needed to engage in play for a set period of time. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. Game-based learning is using an actual game to teach or reinforce a skill. A simulation, on the other hand, is a realistic, controlled risk environment where learners can practice specific behaviors and experience the impacts of their decisions. The most familiar type of that is a flight simulator. A simulation may contain game elements, but the focus is on a realistic experience for the learner. Here is a good way to think of the difference between a game and gamification. Think of it this way, like the old SAT problems. Gamification is to game as piece is to pie, or steering wheel is to car. Gamification uses parts of games. Another way to think of gamification is as a continuum. On one end is simply adding points to a learning event, and on the other is a fully immersive 3D learning equivalent of Halo. Most gamification efforts are somewhere clearly in the middle. Additionally, gamification can be further refined into two types: structural gamification and content gamification. Structural gamification is the application of game elements to propel a learner through content with no alterations or changes to that content, only the structure around the content. A common implementation of this type of gamification is to take the scoring elements of video games, such as points, levels, badges, leaderboards, and achievements, and apply them to an educational context. An example of structural gamification in a learning context is when a student receives content to be learned through a quiz-type game on a daily basis for a 2-week period via email or through a mobile app. The student receives an email with a quiz question containing content to be learned. If they answer correctly, they earn points and progress toward earning a digital badge. If answered incorrectly, the student is immediately presented a short instructional piece designed specifically to address the topic covered in the initial question. Questions are repeated at various intervals until the student demonstrates mastery of the topic. The entire process takes 30 to 90 seconds each day and is done either at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day based on the choice of the student. As the student is progressing through the content, the number of questions they answer correctly are indicated on a leaderboard for the entire class to view. This enables the learners to assess their progress relative to others. Content gamification is the application of game elements, game mechanics, and game thinking to alter content to make the content more game-like. A common implementation of this type of gamification would be to add the elements of story, challenge, curiosity, mystery, and characters to content to engage the learner. For example, adding story elements to a series of math problems to place the student in a fantasy context, or to start a classroom dialogue with a challenge instead of a list of objectives. These are both simple methods of content gamification. An example of content gamification in a learning context is when the learner takes on a role and participates within the context of a story. In teaching the topic of accounting, a learner could begin the instruction with a challenge. Complete this audit in 1 hour or your client goes to jail. The learner could then be dropped into the middle of an audit and asked to produce a requested list of documents for the IRS using basic accounting procedures. Within the context of this gamified learning event, the learner must complete the correct document request forms, retrieve filed information, and take that information to the auditor's office to avoid arrest. The learner is scored on accuracy of documents, speed of responding to requests, and whether or not the right documents were provided to the mock auditor. This is an example of content gamification. So in conclusion, knowing the two types of gamification will help you think how you want to apply gamification to your own content that you design. Remember, gamification is simply applying game elements, game thinking, and game mechanics when designing instruction. You can apply these ideas to help move your learner through instruction, or you can apply them to actually alter the content of your instruction. So now that you've had this brief definition of gamification, you can now use your knowledge to create your own engaging, game-like learning events.